It's a pleasure to be at this conference. I found it a Steppenwolf-like experience. You know that scene in the Hermann Hesse book where he walks around this carnival and there are all these different rooms, and each room he walks into is another little world, and all kinds of people interested in knowledge and games and juggling are being active. So I found it particularly interesting to be here, and I'm grateful to the organizers for putting it on so well, for inviting me, giving me this opportunity to talk about the future of biology. I'm not a biologist, but an anthropologist. Means I study human beings. Biologists are human beings, and I have been studying them. In fact, they are biological organisms themselves, and I am also a biological organism, as are you. So here we are, human biological organisms, having a conversation about biology. I would like to make this a conversation, so what I'll try to do is compact what I have to say to about half an hour, and so then we can do a little bit of dialogue, because I think there's a lot of knowledge in this room that isn't only inside my own head. Well, I came to biology through a back door because as an anthropologist I was working in the Amazon with indigenous people who consider that plants and animals have intelligence, that they're human like us. Our normal gaze shows us birds and fish. But when these beings go home at the end of the day, they unzip their animal suits and outstep people. They think that shamans can communicate with other species in visions and dreams, and they use psychoactive plants like ayahuasca and tobacco to get into these altered states of consciousness in which communication with other species occurs. Well, this led me to try to understand what these people were talking about, and I was born into rationalism, materialism, and humanism. And I came to see a striking series of correspondences between what shamans perceive in their visions and what molecular biologists have started to pick up on in their labs over the last 50 years. Indigenous people say that there are essences that are common to all life forms and that are the sources of information that they receive in their trances. Well, since 1953, science has put its finger on a molecule called DNA, which is present in each cell of each living being and which is source of information. So the animist point of view that there are essences common to all life forms that animate them is confirmed by molecular biology. The very shape of the DNA molecule, which is two complementary strands wrapped around each other, the double helix shape, shows up in images painted by shamans on 5 continents for millennia in the form of the axis mundi. I invite you to read Mircea Eliade's book on shamanism, printed in 1951, in which he documents this exhaustively. The axis mundi being the shape with which shamans around the world associate the essences or spirits that animate the different life forms. So shamans have identified, long before biologists, the central importance of this form for life. These are some of the correspondences between these two domains that have until now been a priori separated. I put this into a book published 11 years ago now in French called The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge. But despite these convergences, there continues to be a separation between the two domains, or at least it seemed to me, because indigenous shamans are attributing intelligence and intention to other species, whereas up until recently, Western science has tended to consider other species as devoid of intention. This is even its central method, if one is to believe Jacques Monod in his book Chance and Necessity. The postulate of the objectivity of nature is to presuppose that there is no intention anywhere in nature. That is the cold gaze of science. And it starts with Descartes, who put down on paper that animals are machines. They don't feel pain even. Even if you vivisect them and they scream, this is just an automatic reaction. So there seemed to be a fundamental difference between these two ways of approaching the living world. But I try to work on my own presuppositions, and I know that I'm a Westerner and that I tend to dichotomize. This is how we know. We separate things to understand them. That's the power of rationalism and reductionism. But, well, maybe indigenous knowledge and science are not all that separate. Maybe science is changing. I've been reading scientific journals like Nature, Scientific American, La Recherche for 11 years now. That's how I started studying biologists, by studying their writing. And I can say that it's easier to make sense of Amazonian tribes than it is to make sense of molecular biologists. Thank you. And what I've seen in recent years is that science itself is changing, and there are now all kinds of scientists in different countries who are documenting the fact that bees with brains the size of pinheads can handle abstract concepts. Brainless plants can make correct decisions. Single-celled slime molds can solve mazes. In recent years, there's all kinds of scientific evidence that nature teems with intelligence. So, as of the year 2001, I decided to launch an investigation on this subject of intelligence in nature as seen by science. So, meanwhile, future of biology. How does one know the future? Well, there are different ways. The way that I'm working on here is not really with the crystal ball. It's to look at current trends, look at how things are changing now. So, if you want to know the future, it's good to understand the present, in other words. So I decided to wander into the present of scientific labs at the beginning of the third millennium. This was going to be a new field for me. My field until then had been the Amazonian rainforest, and the new field was going to be labs and scientists. And I decided to put everybody on the same ontological footing and to treat scientists with the same respect as indigenous shamans. I started in Toulouse, France, at the National Center for Scientific Research, at the Laboratory for Animal Cognition, where a researcher called Martin Jorfa and his colleagues had recently demonstrated that bees handle abstract concepts, and they had published their results in the journal Nature. To do this, they came up with a very simple and elegant experiment. They constructed a simple Y-shaped maze, the entrance to which was marked with a sign, the color blue, for example, And when the bees flew into the corridor, they would reach a branching pathway or decision chamber with two paths, one marked with the color blue, the other with the color yellow. Bees flying down the blue marked path, or the path with the same sign as the one at the entrance, found at its end a vial containing a sugared solution. Bees going down the yellow marked path received no reward. The bees soon learned that same sign equals sugar. In subsequent experiments, they switched the signs, no longer colors, but vertical and horizontal lines, for example, and the bees passed with flying colors. This demonstrates that bees with brains containing about 100,000 times less neurons than our own can handle abstractions such as sameness and difference. Well, Martin Jurfa, the man behind this experiment, said that the more we know about how animals learn and make decisions, the more we have to recognize that they do not act mechanically. Bees are sentient, intelligent beings, and they are neurologically equipped to extract the logical structure of the world, he said. So bees are sentient beings, not flying toasters. But what about plants? Plants lack brains entirely. I started looking into what science currently says about plant intelligence, and in 2002 found an article in the journal Nature by a biologist called Anthony Trewavas, stating that the study of plant intelligence was becoming a serious scientific endeavor, and that plants have intentions, calculate complex aspects of their environment, and make correct decisions. In early 2003, I traveled to Edinburgh to interview Anthony Trewavas, and he explained that the molecular biology of the 1990s had revealed the receptors and the signals used by plant cells as they communicate and learn. Plants can assimilate information on the whole plant level, calculate complex decisions, and act intelligently. It turns out that what they've learned about the signals that plant cells send one another is that in some cases they are identical to the signals, the molecules that our own neurons send one another as we think. So plants do not have brains so much as act like them. The whole plant is like a brain. It is made of cells like our own brain, and they send one another signals which are the same as the signals our own brains use. Just being a plant, sending down roots in a branching structure and deploying leaves in a way to gather a maximum amount of light, involves integrating a wide range of variables, computing the correct decision, and then enacting them and embodying them. The Amazonian stilt palm is a good example of this. This is a tree that stands on prop roots. It has roots that come out of the ground. And what it does is perceive where the most sunlight is, allow the roots on the shady side to die off, and it grows new roots on the sunny side. And so over a period of several months, at a speed imperceptible to human beings, this tree actually moves, fending off its competitors, and foraging for a maximum amount of light. This is a tree that walks, looking for its place in the sun. Truavis called this a clear example of avoidance action and, intentional behavior by a plant. A clear example of plant intelligence. But what is intelligence? In its original meaning, the word comes from the Latin interlegere, which means to choose between, and implies the capacity to make decisions. But if you look in dictionaries under intelligence, you will find that it has often been defined in exclusively human terms, and by definition cannot apply to other species. It is that which Western cultures have separated ourselves from nature. They said, we are the only intelligent species. It is our treasure. The human specificity is to be intelligent. Everybody else is stupid. So this is our most precious thing. And as such, it has been fought over in terms of just how to define it. There have been so many different definitions of intelligence that at this point it is probably not very intelligent to try to define it any further. This was made particularly clear to me in Japan. In the summer of 2003, I traveled to Hokkaido to speak with Toshiyuki Nakagaki, a biologist who had just demonstrated that single-celled slime molds can solve mazes. Slime molds are special organisms because they usually behave like a glistening mass of mucus that swarms over and engulfs its food, not exactly a prime candidate for intellectual achievement. It is a single cell that can grow as big as a human hand, and if you cut it into pieces, it can also rejoin and form a single cell. Well, Nakagaki and his colleagues published their results in the journal Nature because what they showed was that when you put a slime mold into a maze, it actually reduces its body down to form a tube spanning the shortest distance between the entrance and the exit at which they'd placed food. So it solved the maze, finding the shortest path each time it was tested. Just how it does this is not known. By what mechanism this single cell computes the shortest path is actually being investigated now. Nevertheless, the results are there. And they used the word intelligence in their article. Nakagaki told me that in the media attention that ensued, there had been two main reactions. Japanese reporters were mainly concerned with the details of just how such an organism had solved the maze, whereas Western reporters mainly questioned whether this phenomenon constituted intelligence or not. He attributed the difference to the animist background of Japanese culture and to the Japanese word for intelligence, which is chi-sei, chi meaning to know and sei meaning capacity of or property of. Many Japanese people do not hesitate to attribute a capacity to know to other life forms, including single-celled slime. I asked Nakagaki how he had dealt with the dilemma involving intelligence and Westerners. He said that he had noticed, subsequently to having published his article, that when he used the word smartness to refer to the slime mold's behavior, Westerners agreed. And so since then, he only used the word smartness, which is pretty smart. But in its original meaning, the word smart refers to elegance, tidiness, and cleanliness, and is not that pertinent to intelligence in nature. Even nature is a tricky concept. It is usually defined as the phenomena of the physical world to the exclusion of human beings and human creations. The idea of nature includes a separation between ourselves and other species. And actually, if one is strict with words, intelligence in nature is a contradiction in terms, because intelligence excludes non-humans and nature excludes humans. But this shows that our concepts that disengage us from other species hamper our thinking. We have trouble with words when the slime mold solves the maze because our concepts don't fit the data. It's not so much that nature lacks intelligence, but that our own concepts do. Well, okay. Yeah. Shamans have long said that we have kinship with other species, and science is now showing this is literally true. Half the genes contained in a banana have equivalents in the human genome, which does not mean that you are half bananas. Yeah. Well, now check this out. Lynn Margulis has pointed out that the sensory cells in a human body, we're talking in the nose, on the eyeballs, in the skin, on the taste buds, have cilia. And these are whip-like extensions that vibrate and transform the outside information into electrochemical information inside the body. Well, according to her research, these cilia are descendants of bacteria. In other words, our most sensitive body parts are direct descendants from bacteria. We are built with bits of bacteria. The tail of a human sperm cell is a cilia. Our sperm is powered by an X-bacterium. Bacteria are us. So indigenous people say other species are human, and we think, what does that mean? And then we listen to Lynn Margulis, and you realize that not only do you have more bacterial cells in your body than human cells in your gut, but that your very body cells are made up with X bacteria. Bacteria outsmart us all the time because they are smart like us, and we are built out of them. Well, shamans have known these things for a long time and say that they have got this knowledge out of altered states of consciousness. You may have heard during this conference that Francis Crick, the discoverer of the structure of DNA in 1953 with James Watson, used low doses of LSD as a tool for thinking, and was under the influence of DNA when he came up with the double helix shape. And I was grateful to the previous speaker, Sue, for talking about low dose LSD. I think that one doesn't hear often enough about that. So does this mean that biologists should take hallucinogenic substances for the future of biology? Well, I think that we've learned that one should encourage nobody to modify their consciousness, and that it's not without risk. That much should be clear. I'll tell you about an experience that I had taking 3 molecular biologists down to the Amazon to work with an indigenous ayahuasquero to see if they could learn about aspects of their molecular research in visions induced by an ayahuasca shaman. The point is that altered states of consciousness and science mix with difficulty, somewhat like oil and vinegar. But if you get the proportions right and shake it a lot, it can give good results. What is in question is the power of the human mind, its imagination. Shamanism is putting a harness on the capacity to imagine. This is to have images in one's mind. And the jury is still out about where the information comes from. Of the three scientists, one was a man and two were a woman. The man, who was a French professor in molecular biology, claimed that he didn't learn anything that appeared to come from outside his own head, but said that the experience had helped him put things together that were already there but that had been separate. He was actually looking into how a sperm cell becomes fertile, because when it goes into the sperm duct, the individual sperm cell cannot fertilize an ovum. 50 different proteins work on it like automobile workers in a chain, and when it comes out the other side of the sperm duct, it is capable of fertilizing an ovum. What he was trying to understand was which of the 50 proteins is responsible for making the sperm fertile. The point was to look for a male contraceptive. He asked the ayahuasca sphere 3 questions. Which protein is responsible for making the sperm fertile? Why have we been looking for so many decades without getting the answer? Is it because this is forbidden knowledge dealing with the conception of life? That was a Catholic question. And is the mouse an appropriate model to study this on for human beings? And the answer that he received from a voice fairly immediately into his session was, answer to the first question is that it is not one of the proteins, but all 50 working together. Answer to the second question, why you've been looking for it so long without finding, see my first answer. Answer to the third question, is the mouse an appropriate model? This question is too small for me, you figure it out. Thing is that visions are not reproducible. You cannot hallucinate the same thing twice, nor can somebody else see exactly what you are seeing. Whereas the central method of science is to come up with experiments that are repeatable and reproducible. So to sum it all up, one can gain knowledge even about molecules and biomolecules in particular in these visions, but there is some kind of contradiction when it comes down to the method. And what I propose is opening up to a kind of bicognitivism. This means that the rational approach to knowledge is strong and powerful, and respect to rational science. And I like to know the molecules around me, and I thank science for all this knowledge. But it has blind spots and limits, and I think it is like a reverse camera angle. When you're watching a soccer game, if you have a reverse angle, you can look at the same thing and learn more. And I think that that's what altered states of consciousness are like. So the point is not to degrade science by hallucinating in the lab necessarily, but to have the capacity to think rationally, but also have the capacity to go into altered states of consciousness and imagination and come up with new ideas and then come back. And it is something like learning a second language. Bicognitivism, like bilingualism, is difficult, but it's worth it because it gives another way of looking at the world. Okay. Just a couple questions for the future of biology. DNA is not just a molecule, it is also a coding system. saying that DNA is just a chemical, just a deoxyribonucleic acid, is like saying that the works of Shakespeare are just ink on paper. It's a true statement, but it doesn't say much. Surely the fact that DNA is a coding system does not mean nothing. So what does it mean? You know, there's an alphabet running around every single cell in your body. It's a coding system whereby the individual signs have no meaning. The 4 molecules that make up the rungs of the DNA ladder, to which scientists have attributed the letters A, G, C, T, have no meaning individually. They have to be combined in 3s for meaning to emerge. The genetic code has 64 3-letter words, all of which have meaning, including several punctuation marks: start, stop. Strangely, until the discovery of the genetic code in the 1960s, it was thought that the presence of such codes, where the individual signs have no meaning, was a proof of intelligence, because they thought that only humans used codes where the individual signs are meaningless. But it turns out that every cell in the world uses such a code. There's an underlying symbolic unity in all of nature. Is there a question back there?
Yes. Robert Trivers put out a book a couple weeks ago called The Biology of Selfish Genetic Elements, in which he looks at the competition within an individual's own genome, and it applies it to such questions as deceit, conveying misinformation to others, and self-deception. Have you any thoughts about the function or role possibly of self-deception in the visionary experience? You know, like we sort of come here and say, hey, gee, I had this vision, it must be true, it's all great, it's all wonderful. There might be working within the organism mechanisms with which self-deception has great evolutionary benefit, and visionary experience has not really been discussed or looked at in relation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it joins one other thing that I find interesting, which is that the human brain is unaware of itself. You know, it perceives all other parts of the body and pain and so forth, but the seat of our consciousness does not perceive the neurons as they're firing, and thank goodness. Otherwise, we would not be able to perceive the outside world. So, you know, just being able to perceive the outside world means that our body minds have to hide the functioning of our brain to us. So that's pretty tricky just for starters. And it's true that, as the anthropologist Michael Taussig said, ayahuasca can be the worst of liars. But we can talk about that later if you wish. I'll end with evolution. Oh my goodness, the time is gone, and I haven't left you any time. All right, I'll end with evolution, okay? There are now signs of intelligence throughout the edifice of life. Individual proteins making correct decisions. The cells in your body, the human body uses 11,000 different kinds of signaling proteins. Our body is an edifice. It's having a complicated conversation with itself all the time just for us to be sitting here. We don't even understand this yet. There is semantics throughout biology that hasn't been fathomed yet, but it's all becoming clear. There are tens of thousands of researchers looking into this now. No one is now speaking of proteins or cells or other species as just being stupid bits of matter. Science has evolved, and that's good news. But if the smallest elements or bricks of life are themselves intelligent, it would seem to me that this indicates that the evolutionary process that produced them is itself intelligent, and that it is guided by an intelligence within rather than by blind chance or an intelligence above. And yes, this is a kind of synthesis between that debate. However, this is about final causes, and it cannot be, questions about final causes cannot be settled in any definitive way. Some questions intrigue us because they concern us, but that doesn't mean that they can be answered in any definitive way. We would like to know how life on Earth got started, but perhaps we can't. However, it would seem to me that if evolution itself is intelligent, and if all the edifice of life on Earth is also intelligent, that changes the way we think about the whole thing, including who we are and what our role is. So maybe we can't answer the question of how life got started, but there are questions that are much more close to us and that we can work on. And I think the central question is how can we learn as predators to stop degrading the world we live in? By understanding ourselves as animals, by recognizing the intelligence of other species, by understanding the intelligence of predators in particular, we can learn to transform ourselves into intelligent predators, and that would be intelligent evolution. Any questions?
It sounds to me that, speaking as you're saying that we are predators, is it such that cooperation is a conglomerate entity? Humans are themselves cooperating together in your mind, or are they competing as
Yes, so the question is, so we're intelligent predators, but we're made of cells. Are our cells cooperating, or are they being selfish, as in that question? Well, I think that research is needed. I think it's a question of interpretation. I don't think anybody holds the truth on such questions. There has been a tendency to look at the selfish aspects of biological life, you know, the selfish gene and so on and so forth. But it also seems undeniable that your average human body is a very active act of cooperation by 200 different kinds of cells sending one another all kinds of messages in real time. And there are scientists who put the emphasis on symbiosis in biology. And actually, if you look at the tail of the sperm cell, which is a bacterium, you know, bacteria or their descendants are helping us being ourselves. So, but life itself, if you look at it, feeds off itself. That's why we are predators. We eat other organisms. Only plants eat light. But once you stop being a plant, well, you feed off organic matter and you move around. That's the definition of an animal. So life eats itself. The vegetal life eats light from space, and we eat the plants and other animals, and animals also do this. So it seems to me that life is pulling itself up by its own bootstraps. It started with bacteria, and then it changes. That's its essence. It loves to transform itself and to stay the same. It likes to combine contraries. Just look at the double helix. So it's cooperation and selfishness. It's red in tooth and claw, but also working together.
You said that nature doesn't lack intelligence or concepts, do you? That seems it brings it all down to concepts. And concepts is semiotics, and seems we're evolving a sort of DNA semiotics here. So maybe the future of biology is very much the future of linguistics. And maybe the center of linguistics is our interaction with the codes that are in fact us. And well, maybe not be that we're hitting a stage where learning about the processes is to a large extent done, and now we have to learn practicing the skills of this interactivity with the DNA that we've discovered. And that this may be the future of evolution, of semiotics, and of ayahuasca.
Well, yes, I won't be able to repeat it all, but it was good. And what he put on the table was, what we're talking here is biology has now reached semantics, the semantics of the living, and this is what it's all about. And actually, Sorry?
The interactivity.
And the interactivity.
Even more central.
And so we are the linguistic species, and now we're understanding that the rest of biology itself is in its essence linguistic, and so is biology not going to become a kind of biolinguistics? Well, yes, and I was actually going to make that point but ran out of time, so I thank you. And what I would have added was that what's interesting is what anthropology has learned. It learned in the 1960s that it is not a science because it interprets human reality. And interpretation, it's like being a film critic or a wine critic or a food critic. It's necessarily subjective. And so, interpretation there is not objective interpretation. Ça n'existe pas. So if what biology is getting to semantics, and semantics is interpretation, then biology is going to run out of the objective domain, and it's going to have to get into subjectivity. Okay.
No, you won't, because the critic is part of the film and depicted in the film. And there are two ways of describing a whole as an image. You can do it by metaphor. That is placing yourself outside. You will have to then increase the objective domain and reduce the subjective domain. But if you do it metonymically, taking one part for the whole, like talking about I've got wheels, meaning I've got a car, that's the only way we can describe the whole without leaving the whole. And that may be a new approach of science, trying not to be metaphorical, as we always will be in concepts, but being rather metonymical as a tool that we also make to connect with our inner experiences of the DNA and how it relates to the outward. So the metonymy approach will not put us outside the universe. We can understand the universe from inside, and because we are part of it, the opposition will be gone.
Okay, well, we could talk obviously for a long time. Thank you for your attention, and peace to you all.